Greetings Historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. To get everyone up to speed as to what the Reignited Legend is, it is a collection of comments from a video I did a while back, asking my community what they would wish for in a Legend of Spyro remake. While this goes along with the concept art from the game, the ideas were suggested by fans, with some narrative flair thrown in by me to explain and tie it all together. Let us delve back into the world of the Reignited Legend. Spyro wakes on a strange island. The ocean seems ever-growing, but for Spyro, his focus is on the isle. It has white structures on it, accented with blue lights, seeming far more ancient than anything he's seen. Rocks surround it, but here and there, plants of all types are growing in the cracks. Some are familiar, and some seem far more alien than any plant he's seen. As he travels through the landscape, the sounds of the ocean disappear, and the sounds of bird songs echo between the rocks. You can explore further, finding relics and bits of lore from all sorts of time periods, collectible to keep and learn about. Spyro eventually is led into the structure, leading to a large cave, guarded by creatures of fine carved stone. Lights glow from within them, charging at Spyro with synchronized moves, though they are beaten by Spyro. Eventually, Spyro arrives in a circular chamber filled with rows upon rows of books. In the center, a large hourglass, sand slowly dripping down. Then, out of seemingly nowhere, a hum is heard from a deep, gravelly voice. A cutscene would play. Spyro peers to see who it is, and it's a dragon, larger than any he's seen, wings torn and adorned by a cape of blue. His scales are gray, a horn is broken. He turns slowly and speaks to Spyro as if he knew exactly where he'd be. The conversation begins with confusion from Spyro, asking who this strange dragon is, even asking what kind of dragon he is. He simply answers that he's the Chronicler. Spyro asks if that's his real name, thinking it's quite an odd one, maybe chuckling awkwardly at his own joke, but the Chronicler pauses. He stares at Spyro with a blank expression, saying that the Chronicler is his name and his title. A title passed down from one dragon to the next, a tradition passed on from eon to eon. He'd speak of all the books under his protection, some that he hadn't even read, containing most of dragon history, and that he'd been reading the one leading to this moment for some time. Spyro asks how he got there, and the Chronicler simply says it was the Leviathan that brought him to the White Isle. The cutscene would go on, similar to how the original went, with the Chronicler getting to the story of another purple dragon, one before Spyro. His name wouldn't be uttered, just simply at one time, he was similar to Spyro, and that eventually he became the Dark Master. You'd see the story, fuzzy and blurred, still mirroring Spyro's own ascension with the elements in the first game. Then the question of Cinder would come up, of her destiny in all this. Visions of the future dominated by the Dark Master would appear, a world shattered, echoing the events of Dawn of the Dragon. Spyro, like the original Eternal Knight, refused to believe this and wished to charge head-on into the Dark Master's lair and free Cinder. Believing this to be a risk too great, the Chronicler attempts to keep him there first through the same beings sent at first, and then by forcing Spyro into the dreamscape. Spyro finds himself alone. In the distance, he sees what looks to be a part of a broken temple, and he walks toward it. He finds himself surrounded by what seem to be dragons, in a city of limestone. This is another playable area, where you can walk around what was the city of Warfang before the war. You could go around and read or collect, but eventually Spyro would find himself in a circular room, and face to face with the same dragon we met before, the one from the elemental level up wheel. He'd remark they needed to stop meeting like this, but Spyro would explain his situation, and unsurprisingly, Dragsooth would mention how crossing a chronicler, like he did, was brave, or rather foolish in this case. He then would say he wanted Spyro to meet someone, and would take him to another part of the temple, all the while remarking how Warfang was, how it might have changed over the years, perhaps even what it might have looked like if the war never happened. As Spyro, you'd be able to see how the city looked, from Dragsooth, information about it, and even remarks about who the Dark Master was, in almost a fond tone. It'd be then that you meet the other elders, who just like Dragsooth would have names from the ones on the elemental wheel. Through the level, you would then have to fight varying enemies, and the environment would change as well, as the elders taught Spyro how to channel his energy and fight with a chronicler put in place to stop him. Spyro would eventually find his way to what seemed like the end of the level, but will be challenged by the elemental dragon. It looks similar to corrupted Cinder, like in the original, playing off of Spyro's fear, and the purple dragon would be taken aback by it. But the fight would begin, and as Spyro switched into different elements, you'd be able to see all around you the environment change to suit the element. Eventually, Spyro would prevail, and break out of the dreamscape, to the chronicler's surprise. Spyro might make a remark about being someone who knew what was going to happen. He seemed like he didn't see that coming, or something along those lines. There'd be a pause between Spyro and the chronicler, and suddenly the chronicler would ease up, and tell Spyro that if he could do something unheard of like that, then perhaps there was a chance for Cinder. If he wished to continue to hone his skill, then he could stay and depart when he felt ready, opening up the White Isle as a training area, like the Dragon Temple in the Reignited A New Beginning. The chronicler would tell him he'd need something in the path ahead, knowledge of how to bend time to protect him, and he'd show a simple depiction of this, but he'd warn it was not to be used lightly, addressing the risk it entailed, being stuck perhaps forever. Spyro would look to Sparks nervously, and simply nod toward the chronicler. Before we continue, I just want to mention something about Dragon Time, since we're still at the White Isle. Dragon Time in this version of the Eternal Night only slows down everything around Spyro. Spyro himself moves at normal speed, and as you go through the game, these abilities get stronger. Perhaps at first, Dragon Time is like the original version, but as you progress, it gets better in some way, either through puzzles you need to solve, or through upgrades to it. Maybe there's something in the White Isle for this specifically. The game continues as the original did. Spyro leaves to where Cinder is, but not before being told by the chronicler that he can always revisit the White Isle in the dreamscape. Beckon to the chronicler when asleep, and he shall return to the Isle. The game would continue as normal up to when Spyro gets to the Well of Souls, and text would show on the screen, beneath the moons. You would fight your way through the apes once more, being able to collect certain objects, perhaps even things that answer more about what you saw in the Celestial Caves with the chronicler. It'd feel like the place was dead, with the same green energy flowing from different parts of the level. Apes would be there, as well as other creatures, perhaps some that you might have not seen before. Perhaps even some that you did see but defeated, like bosses, or some form of them. Something about them wouldn't seem right, and with them being drawn to the Well of Souls, one couldn't be blamed for thinking that they might have been acting strange. Perhaps if the player left them, you would be able to see them all walking toward the Well of Souls. You would, though, eventually reach the end of the level, and before confronting Gaul, the game would transition to Cinder in her own dreamscape. Cinder wakes up once more in a strange land, though familiar as she puts it, a distant land in her dreamscape. There are remnants of her past floating about, though there is something new, the Watcher. He follows her either just through voice or visually, perhaps telling Cinder where items might be, and here and there pointing toward a piece of his past. He might mention powers he has, or something that he did in his life, though he'd not make anything clear. It'd all at this point be pretty vague. Now, this level might be rather short, really made to reflect on Cinder's situation, fighting a boss to learn more of her own elements, unlocking new gameplay abilities. Poison would become available here, as the Dreamscape challenges Cinder. Poison would be her most damaging ability, dealing with small foes and slowing the speed of larger foes. The Watcher would push her to use her abilities, and perhaps when you reach the end of the level, the boss you fight is a dragon, a dark purple dragon. His face would be shrouded, only seeing a faint light from the eyes, but would be similar to that of Spyro's and the Watcher's appearance. She feared them, and it would be here where the Watcher would tell her to fight fire with fire, or rather fear with fear. It'd be in this fight where you finally unlock the element of fear. Fear would stun enemies, paralyzing them. There'd be some speculation over if this was a manifestation of some twisted purple dragon, but before Cinder could find an answer, the level would end. The game would go back to Spyro's perspective. This part of the game would be the fight with Gull, King of the Apes. Spyro sees that Cinder is being kept captive, and like the original, the Eternal Night is forced to fight. Unlike the original, there is a fight with Cinder, though she seems to be losing control of herself, but keeping these outbursts of elements in check. Eventually, Spyro and Cinder are able to end the fight, and try to turn their attention toward Gull. Perhaps then there could be some sort of tag team between Spyro and Cinder, the player being able to take control of either Spyro or Cinder in the fight, but both working to weaken the Ape King. This could be some sort of boss fight where there are waves of apes coming at the player, while they eventually switch with Gull taking on the dragons. Though eventually there are more apes than can be dealt with, and Spyro, to save Cinder, pushes her to a safe place in the well. The fight goes on, and eventually the eclipse begins, playing a cutscene showing Spyro undergoing a strange transformation. It'd be here where a secret is revealed, that in the time that Spyro spent in convexity, all the strange things happening to him and his elements were due to a darkness growing within him. His powers, his emotions were beginning to be at its control, and as the moons came together, it became more powerful. As the eclipse began, this darkness won, turning Spyro's eyes a glowing white, and his scales would be covered in a thick blanket of dark energy. Thinking that the power and influence of the Dark Master are now in Spyro, Gull tempts fate by commanding Spyro to strike at Cinder, but nothing is said. Spyro glares at Gull, and Gull is now defending against Dark Spyro. And this is when you first get to play as Dark Spyro. Of course, Dark Spyro in this would be just as strong as he was in the original, though perhaps with some extra abilities. Mixes of Spyro's normal elements and the twisted forms. Cinder tries to call to Spyro, though everything Spyro hears is distorted. Then comes the time when the player beats the boss fight, and Gull is turned to nothing but stone by a blast of dark aether. Then, as the fight ceases, Cinder tries to approach Spyro again, but is faced with the same glare given to Gull. The fight continues. It's Dark Spyro and Cinder facing off. This boss fight probably would be filled with quite a bit of dialogue, but the perspective would change again to Cinder's. The fight from Cinder's perspective would be brutal, and at this time you could hear and understand what she was saying, telling Spyro to stop and that they didn't need to fight. It would, however, be up to Cinder to stop him, and eventually, by using whatever she could, she did. Spyro would be on the ground, dazed by the flurry of attacks. The taint would still be on him. They would fade as Cinder finally could reach him, and the darkness would fade away. But around them the well would be collapsing, and like in the original, Spyro would form a time crystal around himself. Cinder and sparks, and the game would end with a strange laugh fading from a younger dragon to a far, far older one. Now, by the end of the game, there would be more content, and not just a cheat code to use Dark Spyro like in the original game. In the dreamscape, Spyro, Cinder, and Sparks would find themselves back on the White Isle, and this would act as a sort of hub for endgame activities. You would collect things you missed, either there or by replaying missions, through a central piece that would look similar to the Pool of Visions. If you already played through something, you'd be able to skip the cutscenes, or originally unskippable sections. As for the collectibles regarding history, they would be sort of like the Sepia cutscenes, being given narration, and given a small cutscene. As well, there might be a training room to test Spyro and Cinder's abilities in the confines of the White Isle. Given you would be able to replay levels in this, you could use elements leveled up throughout the game for both Spyro and Cinder as a way to get to areas you might have not been able to before. A small detail here to mention is that the architecture, even if in an older form, would be similar to the Dragon Temple. The design made in a way to show similarities and spins on a core design idea. This would be through the Pool of Visions, but perhaps other aspects of the White Isle and the Celestial Caves. In addition, if the game is 100% complete, there are other levels, known as Tales of the Elements, where you could play as other characters. Pyra at another point in their life, perhaps carrying on from their story in A New Beginning, the Guardians, and others like Hunter. There could also be a way to learn where characters have gone, again like Pyra, Flame, and Ember. Through this you could see many perspectives. Perhaps you could even play as alternate purple dragons, allowing you to see the heroics and horrors they display. This would be made in a way to bring into question the true standing of the purple dragons, if they are at all good, or if they could perhaps fall to evil. These would be unsure if these were just simply tales, or if they were real, leaving the question of multiple purple dragons up to interpretation so it wouldn't change anything for Dawn of the Dragon. As you completed the game, there might be some lore pointing toward who Spyro's parents were, if there are wind dragons in the world beyond the White Isle. Wind dragons themselves would be in hiding, their existence almost being snuffed out, and living in isolated areas. As for Spyro's parents, there might be some pointing toward Ignitus, there might be pointing toward another dragon, but still it'd be up for debate in the lore. The chronicler might help out in some way, pointing Spyro in the right direction. There could even be another level where Spyro, using the dreamscape, visits Pyra, finding him with a crippled wing on an island in an unknown part of the world. Pyra would be happy to hear Ignitus was still alive, but perhaps jealous that Spyro had now come under Ignitus' wing, in Pyra's absence. Perhaps there's even solo levels after this, or dialogue, such as Cinder being completely alone. No Watcher, no Sparks, and no Spyro. This would be a sort of alternate ending in terms of the story, where Cinder is unable to get to the Time Crystal, and is left alone while Spyro is kept inside. She's blasted away by magic or some other force, and is made to find the others such as the Guardians, in a sort of flip of the main story. A hunt, and drive to save Spyro, made to emphasize Cinder's affection towards Spyro much like how it had been built up during the main story. Proximity to the blast of the Time Crystal might give Cinder some form of dragon time, allowing her to use it in this alternate ending. This might be instead of slowing things down, rather speeding things up, allowing Cinder to get slow-moving objects to move faster than Spyro would, and would perhaps in this case have something to do with her corruption. Essentially, it twisted Spyro's take on dragon time. The rest of the game would be spent doing these quests, learning of other things such as the cut sea serpents from Dawn of the Dragon, older dragons, maybe even some of the first. Maybe even you'd be able to find other types of dragons in the records, like water dragons. As always, big thank you to my Patreons, Abyssal Blue, ConquerFan91, Eric Manuel, Jabby, Kiasushin, Lacko312, Lawsy, Nightmare Spyro, and Shaggy. I'll see you all the next time we talk. Stay safe, historians.